I'm Danielle Kashubi with the Western Bird Banding Association, also with the Institute for Bird Populations. Cyndi will be doing our presentation today, and Cyndi started and still operates two MAPS banding stations in Banff National Park and in Waterton Lakes. She's committed to publishing and has co-authored over 20 peer-reviewed publications, half of which are from her research on harlequin ducks, which she's studied since 1995. Cyndi has volunteered on various bird monitoring and banding projects in Alberta, as well as in Montana, France, Costa Rica, Mexico, Ecuador, and Belize. And Cyndi has been on the board of the Calgary Bird Banding Society since 2014 and vice president since 2016, and is currently a co-chair of the steering committee of the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network and a member of the scientific subcommittee. Cyndi's been a member of WEBA since 2004 and looks forward to helping the organization in whatever capacity is needed. And she is also a board member on the WEBA organization. So I'm going to turn it all over to you, Cyndi. And we'll, like I said, if there's questions, put them in the chat or we can ask them verbally at the end. Go for it.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Yeah, this kind of came about a little bit last minute, so that's probably why we don't have quite as many people tonight, but hopefully they will all watch it later if they're interested, and thanks for those who did join. So just at the start here, I was wanting to give a little shout out to Patrick Lamontagne, this illustration, this cartoon. He's the local editorial cartoonist for our local weekly newspaper, and he's got a great website, and he's just got a great eye for wildlife. So this one was actually taken from, there was I think a test being done of the town siren, emergency siren. And when I emailed Patrick to ask if permission to use it, he said, oh, well, I can take the other text off, so that it made it easier for me to put my own title on. So anyway, with that, I'll get into talking about audio lure use during migration in Alberta and Mexico. So what is an audio lure? A lot of people know it as a playback. And in this case, it's the use of playback, recordings, calls, songs to attract birds to an area where they may get captured. Other people use playback to attract birds for bird watching, especially. So this is common use in migration monitoring. It's quite common in Europe, but in North America, it's used mainly to attract northern saw-whet owls and some other owl species to mist nets at night for capture, or for single species specific research. And also in some cases for rare threatened species that are normally found in fairly small numbers. So there are some potential benefits and potential concerns over the use of playback in migration monitoring. So a benefit is you can increase the capture rate most of the time. You can maybe increase the number of foreign recaptures, because the more birds you have banded, the more possibility of someone else capturing one of your birds and vice versa. You can probably improve your statistical power for analyses through having larger sample sizes. And as a result of that, you can get trends perhaps that are have greater accuracy as a result. And some of the drawbacks or concerns that have been expressed in various papers in the literature is that this might interrupt nighttime migration, because usually these audio lures are turned on during the night to attract the migrants. And there may be potential bias in age and sex ratio, or which sex is attracted, of course, to the call, and may influence individuals to stay in the area beyond one night. If you're inducing landfall, perhaps it's not as good a habitat as where they maybe would have landed if they carried on a couple more hours. And there's always the possible increase in rates of injuries and mortalities if you're capturing high numbers of individuals at one time. So I first got exposed to the use of audio lures when the Calgary Bird Banding Society got involved in a project in Mexico. We'd had a project underway, or various projects over the years in Costa Rica, and we were looking for a new location, and linked up with Manuel Grosslet of Tierra Aves in Mexico. And Manuel had a site that he'd been operating for a number of years, and we were looking for a new site, but that wasn't ready yet. So he invited us to join him and maybe do this experiment where we were working at a second site to compare to his standard site. So you can see in the bottom left here, this is the audio playback. So in this cooler is the battery because there was no electricity nearby, so we had to have a good sized battery, and the recording device or the playback device, and then a speaker here. And then we had a series of nets set up around the site. A couple of the species that we caught a lot of birds, a lot of, individuals is Swainson's thrush and yellow-breasted chat. So we established a 4-week project during spring migration. So Migra 2 was Manuel's normal site, and he used the audio lure every day there. And then we were operating Conta 3, which alternated audio lure on and off on consecutive days, day after day, on, off, on, off. So the same recordings were used at both sites, and then they were changed partway through the season as different species were expected. So the playback was turned on at 2 in the morning and broadcast continuously until the nets were closed around 10 a.m., so around 8 hours, unless they were closed early due to a volume of birds captured, and we did do that a few times. So this is location in Mexico. This is a Tehuantepec Peninsula, so kind of the narrowest place between Mexico and Central America, at a town called Minatitlan. Excuse me. And on the edge of Minatitlan is a large Pemex refinery. Pemex is the state oil company. And Manuel they were supporting some of his research and had provided area to do that. And so Migra, one is where Manuel operated, and then about 2.5 kilometers away is where we established the second site. And I had a note from Manuel yesterday saying that he stopped working at this location, kind of a falling out with Pemex, I think, and he's been working about 250 kilometers south on the opposite side of the peninsula. And he did mention that he is not capturing near as many birds there, because I think you can imagine a lot of migrants move along this shoreline. So we've operated from the 10th of April to 10th of May in 2013. At the site we worked at, we got about 2,700 birds. Manuel, with the audio lure going every day, had 3 times that number almost. And 78% of all the birds that we handled were captured on days where the audio lure was playing. So it was very successful. And Swainson's thrush comprised 50% of all of the birds that we captured. And we only recaptured 14 individuals, and the medium time was only 2 days, although one bird did stay for 2 weeks. So very few recaptures. It was mostly migrants moving through, and there was no difference in how long they stayed between the audio lure days or silent days. So get into a bit of the data. This was the capture rate, so birds captured per 100 net hours. And yellow general here is audio lure days, and blue is the silent days. Now, at Migra, remember, they were always operating the audio lure, but for comparison purposes, we wanted to see, okay, on the days where we did not use the audio lure, were we just happening to get a change in migration pattern? And no, it wasn't, because there was no difference in the number of birds coming through. So what we did find, though, is that we had like a 7 times the number of captures on when we were playing the audio lure compared to when we didn't. So from that perspective of increasing your sample size, very successful. Now here's looking at, so we only did analyses for species where we captured at least 25 individuals. And so that was these 2, 4, 5 species here. And you can see a major difference, significant difference for Swainson's thrushes, for yellow-breasted chat, and for painted bunting on the days that we were operating the audio lure, and no significant difference for any of those at Manuel's site. So the birds were moving through constantly. It's just that on days that we had the audio lure going, they were attracted in higher numbers to our site. And no difference for common yellowthroat, yellow warbler. And then looking at the capture rate of the species, we did capture a number of individuals and species that were not found or not being played on the audio lure. So these 6 species here were not, but yet they were still being captured. So is it kind of a case of, well, this sounds like a good place to stop for the night because there's other species, other birds here. And none of these are statistically significant differences, but mourning warbler and gray catbird were close to significant in terms of the number of captures during the audio lure days was significantly, nearly significantly higher than on days where we did not use the audio lure. And really no difference between northern water thrush, Wilson's warblers, least flycatcher, or chestnut-sided warbler. And we also, I mentioned, wanted to look at, were there any differences in which age of birds were attracted or whether males or females were more attracted. And for that, we only had 3 species that we captured in high enough numbers on both silent and audio lure days that we could do these kinds of analyses. So common yellowthroat, yellow-breasted chat, and yellow warbler. And the vertical line is just separating the 3 species. So there was, check my notes here too. So, whoops. So there was no significant difference between any of these situations. And although the common yellowthroat and the yellow warbler, there were generally more males or more females overall than males. Oh, sorry, other way around, more males than females for yellow warbler and common yellowthroat. But there was no difference between days where there was an audio lure used or days where it was silent. Just wanted to show a few pictures of some of the birds that we captured. Of course, painted bunting. When we first arrived, I was sort of saying to Manuel that I hope to get to see some painted buntings, and he kind of goes, "Oh yeah, you will," and we did. We captured quite a lot of the spectacular species, mourning warbler and chestnut-sided warbler. So the next opportunity that, and I forgot, is also showing a few other birds that we captured that, did not become part of our analyses, but of course they're in the net and you get a chance to, we banded them and had a chance to take a look at them. Groove-billed ani, and you do have to be careful of that beak, that's for sure. Golden-winged warbler, yellow-billed cuckoo, and least bittern. I was quite surprised at how small the least bittern actually is. You can see the knuckles of someone's hands there, so they're actually quite a small bird. And possibly my favorite little bird, about the size of our kinglets, is the common toady flycatcher. Really tiny little bird. Same year in the fall, I was traveling in France with a couple of girlfriends, one of whom is a bander, and we had arranged to visit a hawk watch site for a day and then to spend a few days at a migration monitoring station, Cap d'Antibes, on the south coast of France, just west of the city of Nice, so on the Mediterranean, and so pretty good migrant spot. And you can see here this blue spot, that's where the playback machine is. And interestingly, and this was Christophe Baudouin runs the site, and he's only allowed by the agency to operate the audio lure 1.5 hours before sunrise. And so that was, we get there, turn it on, kind of have our breakfast and hang out for a bit, and then open the nets and start capturing. Of course, just a few examples of birds that we captured: firecrest, kind of similar to our kinglets, black-capped, Eurasian blue tit, and of course the European robin. So when Christophe had mentioned this 1.5-hour limit, I thought, well, here's maybe an opportunity to kind of test out this longer audio that we were doing in Mexico versus this shorter audio, because maybe the shorter audio, you're not inducing the birds to stop that much before sunrise. So I had the opportunity. I had retired and we had an acreage, and I decided to do an experiment of spring and fall migration monitoring in 2014. And in both spring and fall, I set up a 3-day cycle. So day 1 was a control, so no audio lure. Day 2 was a short audio lure, so it was only turned on 1.5 hours before the nets opened at sunrise. Excuse me. So that meant there was about 7.5 hours of audio, unless weather intervened. And the third day was long, what we called long audio. So it was turned on 4 hours before the nets were opened. So as a result, it was a maximum of 10 hours and operated 10 nets for 6 hours. So that's kind of the cycle that we established. And this paper, and I guess I forgot to mention too, that both the work in Mexico and this experiment have both been published in North American Bird Bander, so you can get all the detail you want from that as well. And so we did a pilot project for a few days in the fall of 2013 after I came back from traveling. And then in 2014, had 2 spring periods and 2 fall periods. So these periods were just set times where at the end of that period, we changed some of the species that were on the audio lure. So they were consistent within the period, but some were changed between the periods. And then again in the fall. So this was in southwestern Alberta, not too far from or just east of Waterton Glacier International Peace Park and just north of the Montana border. And this was part of our acreage, and we had a shelter belt where we had the nets scattered throughout. The yellow star is where the playback machine was. Of course, we have electricity, so that helped. And then we could operate within this area. The setup that I used was, kind of basic, a laptop on which I had the continuing loop of the recording. So 7 species at a time, each for 20 seconds long. And then, like I said, that was changed after the first 3 weeks. So that was placed in a waterproof ammunition box and hooked up to an outdoor digital block heater timer, so the kind of thing you use on your Christmas lights or on your lights if you're going on holidays. And then it was broadcast, so that was turning it on. And then it was broadcast through an electric guitar amplifier, which when we tested it was giving out an average of 114 decibels. And I picked that up at a pawn shop, so that was handy. Anybody need a guitar amplifier? So in captures, we did in the spring, we had 27 days. So we were able to complete 9 full cycles, nearly 1,400 hour net hours and over 600 birds. And in the fall, we had 30 days. So we had a little bit of weather issue in the spring with snow. A couple of snowstorms had gone through. And then I'd mentioned that analyses are mostly for 25 birds or more for any of these analyses by age or sex or comparing species. Recaptures in the spring, we had 29 birds, so about 4% of the total captures. And again, the median stopover time was just 2 days for those, although they did range from 1 to 5 days. And in the fall, slightly higher number of recaptures, and the median stopover time was the same though. And the stopover time was the same whether it was on the audio lure or not. So again, the audio lure did not seem to keep the birds in the area longer than they would have otherwise. So just looking at it kind of in the bigger picture, in the spring, there was significantly higher in both seasons, spring and fall. We captured higher numbers of birds on the audio compared to the silent. In the spring, there was no difference between the short audio and long audio, but in the fall, the long audio attracted more individuals than did the short audio. And we had enough data for 7 species that we were able to look at. So Swainson's thrush, chipping sparrow, Savannah sparrow, Lincoln sparrow, orange-crowned warbler, common yellowthroat, and yellow-rumped warbler. So Swainson's thrush, Lincoln sparrow, orange-crowned warbler, and common yellowthroat were all captured in higher numbers, significantly higher numbers on audio lure days, and not for the other species. There was no significant difference for chipping sparrow, Savannah sparrow, yellow-rumped warbler. overall, it seemed that the sparrows were not quite as attracted to the audio lure as many of the warblers were. And then looking at the difference, was there a difference between males and females? And again, we only had 2 species that we had enough sample size to look at, orange-crowned warbler and yellow rump warbler. Whoops, back to that. So there was certainly a significant difference for orange-crowned warblers between, silent and audio lure days. This is the long audio and short audio. And same for males and females. There was no difference in that. Whereas with yellow rump warblers, there wasn't a big difference between the silent days, the number of birds when the audio lure was not playing, versus the days when it was. So between males and females. And in general, females, there were more female orange-crowned warblers caught during the longer audio period. Little less clear again with the looking at the age class. So Savannah sparrow, second year and after second year. So basically juvenile and adult, Lincoln sparrow and yellow rumped warbler. Although there's a couple of interesting things. So Lincoln sparrow, there was definitely a difference for all age classes in the numbers caught between a silent day versus either the long or short COVID. Too much pandemic happening last few years. So long or short audio. And there was also a difference in with Savannah sparrows that more of the adults were captured on the long audio than the short audio. And so that was kind of a little bit of an interesting situation there. And then with the yellow rump warbler, they were pretty similar between the silent and the either of the audio overall. So again, I think what this is showing is that there's a lot of this attraction to the audio lures, and whether it's males or females and different age classes can be very species dependent. So I think that's something that researchers definitely have to keep in mind. And then there were 5 species in the fall that 4 of them were significantly, or a significant difference. And interestingly, this was clay-colored sparrow, where they were significantly higher numbers on silent days. So not quite sure why they wouldn't be attracted, although in the fall it would be harder, I think, generally to attract birds using the audio, because not as many birds are singing in the fall, so you don't get that competitive kind of attraction that might happen more in the spring. Whereas Lincoln sparrow or yellow warbler, the audio lure days were always more highly significant. And no significant difference for Wilson's warbler, although it was a little higher on audio days. And we only had 2 species in the fall where we could look at any sex difference, and there wasn't between yellow warblers. Males and females were caught in the same, approximately the same proportions, and Wilson's warblers between long and short audio and silent. So there's really no major difference there. It's a little more complex trying to look, and the age, is there a different age group that's attracted to the audio? So we have clay-colored sparrow, Lincoln sparrow, white-crowned sparrow, yellow warbler, and Wilson's warbler. And one of the things here was that, again, here's a sparrow outlier where there was significantly more individuals captured on quiet days, on silent days when there was no audio lure. And over here in the yellow warbler, there was the hatchier birds were not caught as often on silent days as adults. So adult yellow warblers were caught about half the time on silent days versus the audio lure days. I think there's one more here. Yeah, so on Wilson warbler, that was the only one of these 5 species where there was a difference between the long audio and the short audio for the adults. So adult Wilson warblers were captured more on the short audio days than on the long audio days. So again, just sort of, I think highlighting that difference between species. And a number of the individuals that or species that we had at our site. So Wilson's warbler, warbling vireo, light-collared sparrow, or what we like to call gray-collared sparrow, Lincoln sparrow, orange-crowned warbler, and Savannah sparrow. So also, again, caught a number of species in much smaller numbers that, didn't make part of the analyses, but that were really interesting to handle and learn to age and sex. So brown creeper, Harris's sparrow, the only one I caught, the ruby-crowned and golden-crowned kinglets, and a nice look at the crown patterns there, western tanager, and a pair of leisurely buntings. So there were some study limitations for, real sites. So, the choice of what call or song clip to play for each species could have a large influence due to regional differences in call patterns and calls and those. So, probably I think I would recommend that someone do their own perhaps recording of the species in advance so that in the area or the region they're working in, they're more highly tuned to that local dialect. We only played for 20 seconds for each species, and then that call wasn't heard again for over 2 minutes. So 2 minutes gives quite a bit of time for individuals or species that could fly over or fly past the site. Of course, you can't control the weather and the influence of that in terms of inducing stopover and the season that progresses within each of those 3-week periods. We tried to choose our species on the audio lure based on previous experience and talking to a lot of other birders in the area to understand what species might be going through, because we wanted to try to attract enough individuals of any species so that we could do some of these analyses. And so, overall, definitely using an audio lure increases the capture rate and thus your sample size for analyses. There were quite a few non-target species that were attracted in higher numbers during those audio days. And I mentioned it because that's sort of the safe haven theory. A bird flying over and they hear some other species and songs from a site, and well, maybe that's a safe habitat for them to stop over on. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, the age or sex class that's attracted to the audio lure, it does appear to be species dependent, although in our work it seemed like warblers were a little bit more attracted than sparrows. And there's no difference in stopover time between the audio lure or silent, so it didn't seem like that audio lure was an influence in keeping the birds around longer. And in the one study in southern Alberta, there didn't seem to be any difference really between the long and short audio, a little bit better in the fall. So I do think using the shorter audio, just turning it on an hour and a half before sunrise and before opening nets, may be sufficient to increase the sample size, but not be impacting the induced landfall as much as playing it for an extra 3 hours during the night. And I'd like to mention that, thank the Calgary Bird Banding Society funded the Mexico project. Marcel Gabauer and Doug Collister were main people behind helping set that project up. Of course, Manuel and Georgita in Mexico, various volunteers who helped with both projects, Christophe Baudouin in France. And here again are the 2 papers that you can look them up in North American Bird Bander. And that's it, Danny.
Awesome. Very cool. Yeah, you had me riveted. I was like, oh, what's going to happen next?
Well, thank you.
Yes. So if there's questions, you can just unmute and we'll try and pick you out. Anne, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
A comment and a question. I thought it was really interesting, having just attended a Northern Solid Owl meeting this week when we discussed the effect of the audio lure, and basically it quadrupled or even had a greater effect on the attraction of saw-whets to the nets. For the passerines, it seems to be considerably less. Do you think that this might be, as you were suggesting, that you're playing a mix of songs rather than targeting is?
Yeah, I think you faded out a little bit. Yes, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons why, although some of the passerines, like, painted buntings, we caught them at 18 times the higher rate during audio lure than silent, and Swainson's thrushes was like 500 times higher or something. It was crazy how many Swainson's thrushes and yellow-breasted chats were attracted to the audio lure. So it really is species dependent, but I think, yes, if you were just playing a single call, then you don't have any of those gaps for birds flying over. So anything flying over would be listening to that same call. So you probably would increase the number of captures for that species. And, that carryover effect, like I said, some of the other species would end up stopping as well.
Right. And David O'Kine's just put a note in the chat that was kind of my follow-up question on that. And that's how does this affect the protocols that stations have in terms of their standardized monitoring when they throw the audio lures into the mix?
Right. Good question. I did mean to address that. And so the reason we were able to do it at these two sites and felt it was worthwhile was neither is a migration monitoring site. So, in Mexico, Manuel was capturing basically year-round, attracting different species. So it wasn't a nationwide protocol or anything like we have here in Canada, the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. And then at our private property, we were just able to do it under permit, from the provincial government, but it wasn't going to affect any protocols that were in place. So yes, I wouldn't recommend it if you've already got an established migration monitoring protocol underway. Would drastically change your capture rates, because again, if there's different age class or different sex that's attracted to it, then that's certainly going to throw off some of your other data analyses that you might do. So I wouldn't recommend adding it to an existing protocol, but it could be useful for a site that maybe someone is just starting up.
Thanks, Cyndi.
I don't have the chat open.
Yeah, the chat says, just from David O'Kines, it says Leslie Howes from the banding office is working on a guidelines for the use of the audio lures for the bird capture. So that's good. I know this was during migration, did you put any resident calls in there, or you didn't want to catch that many chickadees?
No, and well, at our we didn't have a lot of resident species at our small shelter belt, so it wasn't a big deal, although that may have influenced like clay-colored sparrow, because they certainly were in all the agricultural fields around. So that might have been why they were in higher numbers maybe than expected on silent days, even rather than just on audio lure days. Was because of the agricultural fields around. More of the sparrows were in the area than the warblers.
I did wonder about that. So, okay. Yeah. And so, okay, that's perfect. That answered that question for me. Any other questions from the crowd? So are you planning to continue any more of the audio lure work, or was it just to see what was going to happen and then just know that it's an available option if you did want to do another project? Yeah, it was more the latter. I mean, that was 10 years ago. We since sold that spot, so we don't have it any longer anyway. It was a chance because people were questioning what we'd done in Mexico and what Manuel was doing at times, with his high capture rates. So it was just a chance to kind of maybe contribute to the research out there, because at the time when I was contacting Leslie at the bird banding office and asking, what do I need to do, and saying, well, send us a proposal. So I did what we were going to do, and then in the end said, well, we really don't have an authorization for that, so go ahead. Oh,
So
okay.
but I think, yeah, so I go, oh, okay. So, so since then, and others with, Northern Saw-Whet Owl, and so has always had an authorization, but they are, because different people are maybe wanting to do this work, that they have some draft auditor guidelines out there. So maybe, at least we contributed a little bit to that. So
Yeah, I'm curious to see if it will be implemented in a regular migration program anywhere. It will be interesting to see.
well, sitting on the steering committee of the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network, I think basically we've discouraged it in our existing network because we've gone to a lot of trouble to get the entire network working on a pretty similar protocol. So to throw this into the mix would really kind of screw up the data analyses.
That makes sense, yeah. And I'm wondering for the Saw-Whets if there's such a huge difference because they're already so audio focused. Like they don't, like you think your passerines have a visual component where they're moving during the day and they have a daytime component to their lives that's such a big significant, whereas the owls don't. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm wondering if that makes a difference to how they're attracted.
Yeah, maybe Anne has a thought on that. I haven't. Calgary Bird Banding Society does have a Northern Saw-Whet Owl project, but I have not been very involved with it actually. And do you have any thoughts on that success rate in Northern Saw-Whet Owls?
Yes, if you actually check the Project Owl on that site, there's some information on that about it. Basically, they were getting low numbers of saw-whets at a lot of stations before our time, before we got involved. But when they put the audio alert on, the numbers just skyrocketed. Depending on the station, it was anywhere from 4 to 10 times, I think, as many owls being captured with the audio alert. So it was a very significant difference.
And if you're up all night, you want to be doing something.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know when we were at Thunder Cape Bird Observatory, we experimented with the volume and where we were catching the actual saw-whets in the nets. We were recording which panel, which direction. The louder the call, the further away we were catching them. We weren't catching them in the nearer nets. It's almost like they were saying, "I've had enough of this noise. I'm going away," and they all seem to be moving away from the audio system.
And that's really interesting, David, because at Rocky Point, it's exactly the opposite. The greatest captures are within 3 feet of the audio lure.
Yeah, but when we reduced the volume, then we were catching them nearer to the speaker.
So it's kind of a too loud of a volume at some times.
Yeah, pretty much. We're catching them moving away from the speaker, as for when we dropped the volume, we were catching them moving nearer towards the speaker.
Yeah, and we didn't in neither of our projects did we test different levels of playback, but I did just record what basically was the loudest that I could play it on, because we were kind of a small island in a sea of agricultural fields, so wanted to do our part to try to attract the birds.
Hi, Cyndi. Thanks for the chat. It's Ken and Chris up in Fort McMurray.
Hi, Cyndi. Hi,
Hi.
Danny.
Hi, Danny. You mentioned early in your presentation about concerns about injury rates with higher bird capture numbers. I wondered if you saw any of that and how you managed it during your higher capture rate days. And also, did you find any attraction of predators that went into increased predation during your audio lure days?
No to both, actually. So no, we did not have any increase in injuries or mortalities. When we followed quite a few of the protocols, I'm trying to remember now who wrote the paper in North American Bird. I think Marcel was one of the co-authors a few years ago, had a good paper in NAB that talked about some of the ways to reduce injury and mortality, but there was no difference, and we had no increase in injuries. You definitely want to make sure you have sufficient people on site to handle that volume of birds, because we could come back from a net run in Mexico with 50, 60 birds at a time, sometimes more, sometimes 30 birds in one net. So you want to be able to handle that volume. And now I've already talked myself out of your second question. Oh, the predator thing. We did not have any issues here, nor in Mexico, but I can certainly see where you might. I guess the benefit where we were in southern Alberta was, again, it was a small shelter belt, so there wasn't a lot of good treed habitat for the predators to be hanging out in, any of the hawks anyway. And again, we didn't have any marten or weasels around in any numbers either, but that would be something to be thoughtful of as well in planning a project.
Thank you.
Marcel has posted the link to the NAB article in the chat if someone wants to check that out. And then Kevin O'Neill says, no questions for me, but thank you very much for the presentation. Really interesting. And Tim Driscoll says, thank you, Cyndi, Danielle, and everyone else for this presentation. Any other
I don't know
questions?
if Marcel is on, if he had any comments to add to this, or
Marcel was on. I don't know if he has comments.
I am here, but no, you've done a good job. Good to see some of these results again, especially in the broader context. But I don't think I have anything to add. It's I think you've especially put it in context well with migration monitoring and the fact that there is an impact. We don't want to suggest this kind of thing be done cavalierly, but there are times and places, and at least with the work you've continued to do on this, I think we have a better understanding of what an audio lure, what effects it might have, and that can now be taken into consideration better than just kind of guessing at things as we did in the past.
Great. Anyone else with questions?
I've got a quick one, hopefully. Can you talk a little bit more about what kinds of audio tracks you used to compose like the lure tracks? Like, was it calls, songs, flight calls? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so basically I was taking flight calls off of the Peterson collection. That's what I had in my possession, so that's what I used. And but I could see where I think it would be valuable to make a local collection of calls to use. Obviously, you would want to do that if you were targeting one species or a suite of species in particular. You'd want to make sure you're targeting a local dialect and song and so on. So and I don't know, fall could be interesting, like because not many birds aren't usually singing then. So what was attractive to these individuals that did get attracted to the audio lure? So maybe having had a collection of flight calls for those species or interspersing flight calls with song might have been better, but we were just playing song. So I didn't have a good enough collection, I don't think, of flight calls to be able to use that. So, and they probably wouldn't broadcast as loudly either as as songs maybe. But that's a good question. Thank you.
A few years ago, we were catching about 4 or 5 species, like redstart was one of them, and we were collecting blood samples and feather samples from them. But we started off using the Peterson tape, and as we moved further towards Newfoundland, they wouldn't respond to that. We had to record the local birds and play the local birds back. So there's definitely a local dialect. They just wouldn't respond to the other tapes or other calls we had.
Yeah, that's excellent.
David, when you mentioned the blood there, actually reminded me of another question I had earlier, which is, did you see a difference between fat levels or body mass between audio and non-audio days at either site?
Good question. We did not look at that. Maybe when I have time, I'll go back and take a look at that, though. I'll make a note. Nothing, stands out in my mind or recollection about it, but that's a good question.
Okay, great. Well, we can take more questions afterwards, but I did want to say thank you for coming for the Western Bird Banding Association.
Well, thanks, Danny, and thank you to the folks that were able to join us on kind of a short notice. So
Okay, I think everybody
Well,
is just
Blake,
signing
you're-
off. Oh, go ahead, Blake.
here, Cyndi. Do you think
Sorry.
there would be any difference between the kind of terrain that you did in southern Alberta, where it was quite open, in comparison to, say, a similar thing to the maps in Banff? More heavily forested.
There certainly could be. Part of that could even be just how far the audio lure would play in a more open habitat versus a more heavily forested habitat. The sound might not carry as far, but you're also maybe competing with more habitat that the birds could stop at when you're kind of a little island. Like I say, in the agricultural fields, it might have been a little bit more attractive. It'd be hard to know, but there's certainly, you'd want to be aware of those possibilities in planning a project, in depending on the habitat as well as the species that are, like Danny was saying, are any of them resident there versus are you playing just to get migrants that are going through, so that you don't confuse the resident species with the migrant in terms of their response to the playback.
Good. Well, thanks for the great presentation.
Thanks, Blake.